She worked with hands that had already buried too much. The boards were warped, split down the grain, scavenged from what had once been a barn before fire and neglect finished it off. She dragged them one by one across frozen ground, breath puffing white, fingers numb but stubborn. Every nail bent before it went in. Every hammer strike echoed louder than it should have in the open land. She didn't stop, not when the wind cut through her coat, not when her knees shook from hunger, not when the roof sagged because the wood refused to obey her. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. Behind her, at a distance he thought was polite, he stood watching. Her dead husband's brother. He hadn't spoken when he arrived, hadn't offered help, just stood there with his coat buttoned, boots clean, eyes measuring, not the shelter, but her. She felt him long before she turned. The weight of being observed was familiar. It always came before something was taken. "You won't last the night in that," he said finally. His voice wasn't cruel. That made it worse. She kept hammering. "I don't have a choice." He scoffed quietly. "You do. You're just pretending you don't." That got her attention. She straightened slowly, every muscle protesting, and faced him. "My choice was buried with your brother," she said. "Along with the house, and the land, and the name that used to protect me." He flinched at that, just a little. Their husband, their land, their future, all gone the moment the ground closed over him. "I'm family," he said, like it explained everything. She laughed once, short, sharp. "Family doesn't watch someone freeze." He looked away then, jaw tightening. For a moment she thought he might leave. That would have been easier. Leaving meant honesty. Instead, he stepped closer. "You don't belong out here alone," he said. "People will talk. They already do. You're a widow," he continued. "No income, no claim. You can't just build yourself a life out of scraps." She picked up another board, hefted it against her shoulder. "Watch me." The wind rose as if agreeing with her. That night, the shelter held, barely. Snow leaked through gaps. The fire smoked. She slept in short bursts, waking at every sound, every creak that might mean collapse or company. At dawn, she found food at the door. Bread, salt pork, a blanket, no note. She stared at it for a long time before pulling it inside. He came back that afternoon. This time, he brought tools. "I'm not staying," he said quickly, as if she'd accuse him of something. "Just fixing the roof pitch. It'll cave under snow." She said nothing, just stepped aside. He worked efficiently, silently. When a board slipped, she caught it without thinking. Their hands brushed. She pulled back instantly, heart racing, not with want, but with warning. "I don't need you," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm here." The words settled between them, uncomfortable and true. Days passed, then weeks. He returned when storms came. When wolves circled too close. When the creek froze wrong. He never stayed the night. Never crossed the threshold without invitation. Never called it charity. The town watched. Some whispered that he was waiting her out. Others said he was trying to atone. No one asked her what she thought. She kept building. By spring, the shelter was a cabin. Crooked, but solid. Hers. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, he stood at the edge of her land like a man unsure where permission ended. "You could come back," he said quietly. "To the main house. To warmth. To..." "No," she said gently. "I won't be absorbed to survive again." He nodded. "I figured." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, he would've been proud of you." She swallowed. "I didn't build this for him." "I know," he said. And for the first time, he smiled, not possessive, not hopeful. Respectful. Years later, when people told the story wrong, as they always did, they said she was saved. But the truth was simpler, harder, and far braver. She was watched. She was doubted. She was offered an easier way. And she chose, board by broken board, to stand anyway. Spring didn't make things easy. It just made them possible. The ground thawed unevenly, turning paths to mud and testing every joint of the cabin she'd built. She spent mornings shoring up what winter had weakened, afternoons planting what little seed she'd managed to trade for. Her hands learned new calluses. Her back learned new aches. She learned where the sun lingered longest and where frost still hid in shadows. He kept his distance now. Not gone, just respectful. He'd tip his hat when he passed on the road. Leave supplies at the fence line instead of the door. When people asked him about her, he answered plainly, "She's doing fine." That sentence did more than protection ever had. Rumors lost their teeth when they couldn't find a target. One day, a storm rolled in fast, black clouds, wind tearing at the hills. A beam cracked loose from the cabin roof and slammed to the ground. She climbed up anyway, rope biting into her palms, rain soaking through her dress. She almost fell. Almost. The ladder shifted, her foot slipped, the world tilted. He caught it from below, steadying the ladder with his whole weight, shouting up through the rain, "I've got you." Her heart hammered as she climbed down, shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that help didn't always mean control. "I told you not to come," she said, breathless. "I know," he replied. "That's why I waited until you needed me." They stood there in the rain, soaked and silent, something unspoken finally settling into place. After that, they worked together, but always by agreement. She asked when she needed hands. He asked before he offered advice. The line between help and intrusion stayed clear, because both of them guarded it. The town noticed the change in her. She spoke more, walked straighter. When someone questioned her claim to the land, she answered with documents she'd filed herself. When a trader tried to short her, she corrected him calmly and walked away when he refused. She became known for one thing above all else: she didn't bend. Years later, a young widow arrived at her door with a baby and nowhere to go. The woman apologized too much, explained herself too quickly. She stopped her gently. "You don't need permission to survive," she said, and made space by the fire. The cabin grew additions, another room, then a small barn. What started as a shelter became a place others leaned on without it ever losing its center. One evening, sitting on the steps as the sky dimmed, he asked her a question he'd carried quietly for a long time. "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" She thought of the boards. The cold, the watching eyes, the strength she didn't know she had until she was forced to find it. "No," she said at last. "I wish they'd gone honestly. This way, at least I know who I am." He nodded, accepting the answer without asking for more. When people later tried to shape their story into something easier, romance, redemption, rescue, she corrected them when it mattered. "No one saved me," she'd say. "I built myself a place to stand." And if anyone looked to him for confirmation, he'd just smile and say, "I was lucky enough to witness it." The shelter that began with broken boards became a landmark, not because it was perfect, but because it stood. Just like she did, time didn't rush her anymore. It moved at her pace. The land around the cabin began to change in ways she hadn't planned but welcomed all the same. Grass thickened where her boots wore paths. The small garden expanded past neat rows into something freer, wilder. Chickens appeared one spring, left at her gate by someone who didn't have room. She built a co-op without complaint. She had learned that need often arrived disguised as generosity. The dead husband's brother aged too. His shoulders rounded, his certainty softened. He never tried to step into her life again, but he remained nearby like a fixed star, present, reliable, never demanding orbit. Once, when illness swept through the valley, she fell sick herself. Fever took her hard and fast. She woke to find him sitting by the fire, kettle steaming, her shelter quiet and cared for. "You shouldn't be here," she croaked. "I know," he said gently. Sleep. When she woke again, the fever was breaking. The floor had been swept. The animals fed. He was gone. That was how it always was. She grew into a woman people sought out, not for permission, but for perspective. When disputes over land flared, she spoke with clarity born of loss. When girls whispered fears they didn't yet have words for, she listened without fixing. Her story traveled farther than she did. Not as a legend, but as a reference. She built it herself. She didn't wait. She didn't disappear. One autumn evening, years later, she stood where the first broken board had been set. The cabin was solid now. Smoke curled steady from the chimney. The wind no longer frightened her, it spoke a language she understood. He joined her then, standing beside her without assumption. "You did it," he said. She smiled softly. "I did." They watched the horizon darken together. No promises, no rewriting of the past. Just shared ground. And when winter returned, harsh and honest as ever, her shelter stood firm, not because someone had saved her from the cold, but because once, long ago, she had chosen to keep building while someone else stood watching. And that choice had changed everything. The first snow of that winter came quietly. Not the violent kind that howled and tore at doors, but a soft fall that settled on the roof like a promise kept. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching flakes gather on the fence she'd mended herself, on the path she'd worn into the earth over years of choosing to stay. She no longer measured winters by fear. She measured them by readiness. Inside, the shelves were stocked. Firewood stacked neatly along the wall. The roof held. The walls didn't breathe cold the way they once had. Every board told a story of effort, not mercy. The dead husband's brother didn't come by as often now. Not because he wasn't welcome, but because she no longer needed the quiet safety of his watchful distance. That had been a season, and it had passed. When he did appear, it was as an equal. One evening, he brought news. They're building a road through the valley, he said. Closer than before. She nodded. Change always came eventually. People will pass through, he continued. Some won't be kind. She met his eyes, calm. Then I'll decide who stays. He smiled at that, not amused, but impressed. I figured. The road came the next spring. Wagons, traders, families looking for land. Some looked at her cabin with curiosity, others with calculation. A few assumed she'd be easy to pressure, alone, quiet, a woman. They learned quickly. She sold produce at fair prices. Refused unfair bargains without apology. When one man tried to claim her land line by shifting markers overnight, she marched straight to the county office with maps she'd filed years earlier. The marker was returned. The man avoided her eyes after that. A schoolteacher passing through asked her once, "How did you learn to stand so firm?" She thought of frozen fingers. Bent nails. Silence that once pressed too close. "I learned what happens when you don't," she replied. That summer, a girl arrived at dusk, mud on her hem, desperation in her eyes. She stood at the gate twisting her hands, rehearsing apologies she hadn't yet spoken. The woman who had built the shelter saw her immediately. "You can come in," she said before the girl found her voice. I don't have money," the girl whispered. "I didn't ask," she answered, stepping aside. That night, as the girl slept safely by the fire, she sat outside under the stars. The land was quiet, strong, hers. She realized then that the shelter had never really been about surviving the cold. It had been about proving, to herself most of all, that abandonment didn't get the final word. Years later, when her hair silvered and her hands slowed, the cabin would still stand. Others would add to it, repair it, rely on it. Some would never know the full story. But the land would remember. It would remember the woman who took broken boards and turned them into boundaries. Who endured being watched without shrinking. Who accepted help without surrendering herself. And it would whisper that truth into the wind for anyone listening closely enough. Strength doesn't always arrive as rescue. Sometimes it arrives as a hammer in a tired hand, and the decision to keep building anyway.